with the side turned up, and it means the world to me. It's a symbol of our nation, the land of liberty. As the soldiers they wear it, how proudly they pair it for all the world to see. Just a brown swell chap with a side turned up, heading straight to victory. It's just a brown sound.
All right. Well, thank you for the introduction, Andy. Yes, I am a fellow member of the Surrey Branch. I've probably been a member of the Western Front Association for about 7 or 8 years now, starting with really the centenary of the First World War. Now, you can see the title here, Discipline Within the AIF on the Western Front. Last week, I had lunch with a friend, and after I told him I was doing this talk tonight, and he stopped me quite quickly, and he said, Greg, 2 recommendations here. First of all, change the title. It should be In Discipline Within the AIF on the Western Front. And secondly, surely this is going to be the shortest presentation that will ever be, because everyone knows what it's about. So for Peter, this is the title here. The discipline record of the Australian Imperial Force was the worst within the British Army. So I think there's nothing there that we really would argue with, and this is a well discussed subject. But what I'm going to be doing is, in addition to a lot of the official history of the First World War from the Australian perspective by Bean and other papers that have been done as well, I have added the service records of the 5th 22nd from the National Archives into this. And what this is able us to do is to put some personal perspectives onto the whole subject. So tonight's presentation, we're really going to be focusing on a number of key things here. First of all, we'll be looking at the factors which resulted in the poor Australian discipline. And then from that, we're going to be looking at the discipline and the court-martial comparison between the 5th 22nd, the AIF, and also the British Army as well in numbers. So we can actually do some numerical contrast. But really at the heart of this presentation are the case studies from the court-martial. So we're going to be looking at a number of these in a reasonable amount of data. And then finally, a quick look and comparing against the military discipline between the combatants, and then asking ourselves, did the poor discipline negatively impact the fighting capability of the AIF? So let's start with who are the 22nd Infantry Battalion. Well, they were formed in March 1915, so the AIF had already set sail for Egypt and Gallipoli by this stage. And so they were formed into the 2nd Division and formed part of the 6th Infantry Brigade. They arrived in Egypt in June 1915, and then France, they left Egypt in March and arrived in Marseille on the 26th of March. Now, I've listed there the significant battle honours that where they were, but I think the easiest thing to really put into context with the 22nd is that they were one of the last out of Gallipoli. They were on the firing line during the successful evacuation in December 1915, and the 22nd were also first into the line in France, one of the very first with the 6th Brigade, and they were also involved in fighting on the last but one day in France as well. So you can really think of them as being at the bookends of the whole time that the AIF was on the Western Front. Now, I'm going to be looking at the 5th reinforcements. The Australian infantry battalions were reinforced by packets of men throughout the war, and the 22nd were reinforced by a total of 20 reinforcements coming from mid-1915 through to about October 1917. So after that, even though there was another year of the war to go, the only ones that they had were general reinforcements. Now, why have I chosen the 5th Reinforcements? Well, that is quite simple. Yeah, that's because my grandfather, as a 17-year-old lad, he enlisted into the 5th Reinforcements and of the 22nd Infantry Battalion. So this schematic here, what this actually shows is the lifespan of the 22nd when they were in on the Western Front. So the horizontal axis is time, as you can see, and then the vertical axis is 0 to 100%, and the different colors shows what the men were actually doing. So the big purple at the bottom is showing that these are the men that were with the 22nd. And then the green is men that got transferred into another unit, ready detention. Then we've got camp, hospital, return to Australia, discharged, and then sadly the grey at the top is killed. So you can see from this that the real big event that took place was at Poitiers in July and August 1916, when not just the 22nd, but a lot of the Australian divisions suffered badly at that particular time. And so from that time, you can see the purple line. The 5th Reinforcements never got back to more than about 30% of their number that were active with the unit. And I think just a general comment about this is what it indicates that there was a general sort of cycle between men that would be either wounded or they were in hospital, that they would then, well, wounded first of all or sick, would go to hospital. They would then either go back to join the unit or they would have to be returned to Australia. So you can see as the time went on, there was this gradual attrition of the numbers of men that were available to be called upon. And so by the time we get to the end of the war, over 1 in 4 of the men had been killed and over half had been discharged by November 1918. And I think with reference to this particular presentation here, you can see that the red line here, which marks detention, increases as we go through the war. And we'll be talking about that in more detail. So first of all, we're going to be looking at the factors which were resulting in poor Australian discipline. And the first thing really is to do with the character and personality of the man, which was defined by the environment which he was brought up with. And so there's a lot of being said about this, about, what it is to be Australian. And so, you've got people that have come particularly from the old country, class-riven society, into a new area where class meant absolutely nothing. People were going out into the frontier. So there was very much a can-do attitude around the place. And one of the big differences between the Australians and other members of the BEF were that all the way through, they were volunteers to a man. Now, although there was this can-do frontier attitude where there was the belief that if you were working out either in the mines or around the outbush and that you would never leave your mate behind, not everyone was brought up in these sort of outback environments. In fact, if you look at the 5th, 22nd, the vast majority of them were brought up in Melbourne and the suburbs. Now, yes, a lot of them were doing manual type works like labourers and other manual type pieces of work. But what they did is they effectively sort of adopted or inherited the creed or the ethos what it was to be an Australian, and they carried this through to the battlefields of the First World War, which was never to let your mate down. You would put your own life on the line for your mate. And there was always this thing about the fear of being haunted in later life, of not being able to carry things through. So Charles Bean, who he went over to Gallipoli first of all, and then onto the Western Front as the official Australian war correspondent, and then, as we know, became the official historian. He said that the Australian, particularly the private, was quick to act on his own initiative, and as a result, others instinctively looked up to the Australian private as a leader, sometimes to good, sometimes to bad. And so we're going to be seeing some of this as we go through the presentation today. And when we're going to start, actually, we're going to go straight into one, which is Private Reginald Sharples. This actually happened before the men got to the Western Front. So this was in Egypt. And here's Private Sharples here. And at the bottom, you can see there's this image of this train, which is heading through the deserts of Egypt. In fact, the 22nd Battalion are on this very train, but this was taken in March 1916 as they were moving north up towards Alexandria. Now, on this particular day, on the 7th of January, which is the day before the 5th reinforcements got taken on strength into the battalion, there was some sort of incident on board the train. Sharples acted on his own initiative, thought, right, we need to bring the train to a halt, leant over the back, pulled the pin out so that the train would actually decouple, believing that the hydraulic pipe would break and all the brakes would come off. But that didn't happen because it didn't have hydraulics on there. So eventually the uncoupled part of the train came to a halt. But because what he did, it was extremely dangerous, foolish, some would say. He had a field general court-martial, which was held in the desert, and he was sentenced to 12 months imprisonment with hard labor, and he was sent back to Australia. Now, when he actually finished that sentence, so in January 1917, he actually wrote a letter to re-enlist. And here's the letter that's up there. And I'll just read a slight part of it here. It says, "My discharge brands me as a bad character, being actually a life sentence which the court-martial did not include, as I was sentenced to 12 months imprisonment only. I hope, sir, that you will have my discharge cancelled and give me an opportunity to faithfully serve my king and country and earn for myself a clean and honourable discharge." So you can see here that even though he felt that he was doing the right thing, he had gone back, he had served his time, but he had this cloud hanging over him for the rest of his life. So this request was approved. He went back to the front, he served there, and he was wounded towards the end of the fighting in September 1918. What I hadn't mentioned was one of his other reasons for going back, that he had two brothers that was also serving within the 22nd that enlisted with him in the 5th reinforcements. Private John Sharples, unfortunately, was killed in action in April, and his other brother, Robert, who was wounded twice, came home with him as well. The second thing we're looking at is the choice of punishments that were used as laid out in the Army Act. And as you probably know, a charged man would face some sort of trial. The very serious ones had a court-martial. The moderate ones could either have a district court-martial, or they could be tried by their officers and NCOs of the man's own unit. And within the British Army, there are a whole range of different penalties going down. Starting at the top was the death penalty for the most serious crimes, either military, such as desertion, cowardice, etc., or if it was to do with murder. And then coming down from that, you had various forms of incarceration, confinement to camp. Field punishment number 1, which was the shackling of a man to a fixed object, often like a gun carriage or something like that. This took the place of flogging from years ago. So field punishment number 1 was there. Field punishment number 2, which was the shackling of an individual, but out of sight of his fellow men, and other things like reduction in rank and fine. But what happened in 1903, and this follows on from an incident that happened in 1902 down in South Africa in the Boer War, and that was 2 Australian officers, Hancock, and here we have Breaker Morant. They were convicted of war crimes down there of killing prisoners of war. And what happened was that they were court-martialed by British court-martial, and they were killed. Now, the Australian government at that time, they did not, they were upset about the way that they thought that their men would be treated by another country. So they introduced this Defence Act here, which basically meant that men in the Australian Army could only be court-martialed for certain things, such as mutiny, or murder, but also that the British could not actually do the court-martials themselves. So they took control of this, and as time went on, even though Australians had been given the death penalty, none of them were carried through, because they felt that being a volunteer army, that it would have a much more damaging impact on the rest of the men there, and also the amount of reinforcements that would be coming through as the year went on. So basically, the death penalty was not there. But in Egypt in 1915, it was clear that there were problems taking place, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. And here we have a picture of Major General William Throsby Bridges, who himself was tasked by the British to set up a Sandhurst equivalent in Duntroon. He was the leader of the Australians into Gallipoli. He actually was killed in action, and in fact he was shot and mortally wounded. But prior to that, he could see that there was all this trouble taking place in Australia, and he decided, okay, we're going to make an example of these people and send them home, which to the Australians was a really bad thing to do, because that was all to do with dishonour, similar in the way we saw with Sharples. So he got Charles Bean to write a letter to explain why 131 people from his army were being sent home. And it went down quite badly for Bean. Bean was seen as someone that was collaborating with the officers and that against the common man. But it remained the most feared piece of sort of punishment for the Australian up until Poitiers in 1916. And the reason because of that, if you go back to that chart and you saw all those casualties that were happening in Poitiers, there was a lot of people, a lot of men that thought, hold on, you know, I've had 2 tours of Poitiers there. I've seen 10% of the men go back through shell shock, many killed, many wounded in that. If I go and say desert and go to the back, what's the worst going to happen to me? I'll be sent home. Well, maybe that's not such a bad thing to do. So the Australians realized that actually this was going to serve no purpose going forward. So that they got rid of it. So what that meant in the end was, if you take away really the death penalty, field punishment number 1 was not being used because of it was shown to be humiliating to the soldiers, and we didn't have returned people to the back to Australia. Then the worst that could really happen was some form of incarceration. And so men would be going back to places like, this is a picture of Lewes prison down in Sussex. So here, what we can do is sort of have a look to see if there was an impact of the death penalty on the court-martials and rates of absenteeism. So this bottom chart here shows that the number of death penalties that were issued by the different countries there, and you can see that the executions that took place. And Australia was unique in this case, that even though 113 men were charged and given a death sentence, none of them were actually carried through. And the soldiers pretty much knew that that was going to be the case. So if we look how that transfers into the number of court-martials that took place, about 1 in 33 men in the British part of the army faced a court-martial during the war. For the Canadians, it was slightly less, 1 in 25, the New Zealand's 1 in 50, but for the Australians, you can see here, it's 1 in 14. So twice as many people, men from the Australian army, were being court-martialed in Britain than the British. And then if we look at the 5th 22nd, we have a whopping great 1 in 7 of the men faced a court-martial there. So you can see that my grandfather's group, they were a very good case study group to use here. And then so we can see what the impact was having here on absenteeism. And this is just a snapshot taken in July 1918. An order of magnitude more Australians were going absent than the British Army. And the same with the New Zealanders and Canadians. And as we didn't have the death penalty in place and we weren't using much of field punishment number 1, you can see that imprisonment became the main tool for use here. And so there were more absenteeisms in court-martials in the AIF than the British Army here. So that what we've got here in these, effectively we've got three columns. These are the absolute numbers here on the left-hand side. So the 30 court-martials from the 22 men in the 5th 22nd. And if you look here, 73% of these were for some sort of absenteeism, compared with 58% in the AIF, and here we have it in the British Army, so it's 44%, so still the lion's share, but you can see it was considerably more within the AIF and particularly within the 5th reinforcements. And within the 5th reinforcements, 44, these are just the court-martials. Many men went absent without leave as well and just got some sort of fine. And 44 men went AWOL. That's 1 in 4 on a total of 100 occasions through the war. And then if we look at what was happening on the desertion side of the equation here, so a lot more serious, because a lot of the AWOLs were happening away from the front. So these were men that were back home, or sorry, back in the command depots back in the UK or in France and that, so less serious. But what was more serious were the desertions that were taking place here. And you can see that in the first half of 1917, that the British Army, excluding the AIF and also the New Zealanders, were roughly running at about 8 or 9 desertions per division in that time, whereas the Australians were running at 34, so a massive amount more. Now, this was causing a problem, and right from the word go, the British High Command, so Haig and Rawlinson as well, who was looking after where the Australians were during the time of the Somme 1916, were wanting the Australians to actually make some examples of these people that were persistently or the bad desertions. And this even came through to the senior Australian command as well. So, for example, General Birdwood, who led the men ashore at Anzac Cove. You had Holmes, who ran one of the divisions, and Glasgow, one of the brigade generals. They were starting to advocate that maybe it is time to make use of the ultimate deterrent in order to stop this happening. So if we look at the custodial sentences, what actually happened to the men once they were charged, the top 3 are some sort of custodial. So penal servitude, detention, imprisonment with hard labour. Here the absolute numbers in the 5th 22nd, which comes to a total of 73% versus the 34% that was taking place in the British Army. So again, this shows that the men were going into prison. And then also this shows that with the use of field punishment number 1, only 1 man or 1 case out of the 30 received field punishment number 1 versus almost between 1 in 5 and 1 in 4 in the British Army. So this shows that how people were being charged, or the sentences that they would get. The third area is the rates of pay. Now, the Australians were known as the 6 bob tourists, as most of you would know. They were paid 5 shillings a day in their pocket, plus a shilling a day, which is deferred. And they could select how much went back to Australia or not. But with this extra money, it meant that more men were now willing to go absent without leave and accept the fine. And Bean writes that it was Lieutenant Colonel Gellibrand or Gellibrand at that particular time, who was the commanding officer of the 12th Battalion. He later went on to be very successful with the 6th Brigade and was instrumental in the 6th Brigade's success at Bulcourt in his second Bulcourt in May 1917. He would have a man in front of him and say, he said, "Right, soldier, did you have a good time?" "Yes, sir," they would reply. "Was it worth it?" "Yes, sir." "Then you'll be happy to accept the fine." "Yes, sir." There you go, slap the fine and off he would go. So there was a sort of a degree of sort of acceptance that men, if they went away for a couple of days, overstayed leave and absent without leave, that they would come back and be fined. So there was more money for not just paying for fines, but also more money for alcohol and drunkenness. And as you can see from what we have below, the Rising Sun badge was a target for a commonly called exploiters here. So we have in the vertical here, the percentage of men with an STD, sexually transmitted disease, within the First World War. And you can see about 5% of British soldiers contracted an STD, but amongst the Dominion troops, it was a lot higher. Now, part of this could well be the fact that they were away from home, they weren't going back to their families and home depots, etc. But I know that, that the Canadians were on a similar sort of rate of pay as the AIF, but they certainly had more disposable income to spend on extracurricular activities. I haven't been able to actually verify what the rate of play of the New Zealander was. So if there's anyone that's watching that can actually message later about what that is, just to see if they are in that same sort of bracket. Then the fourth area is around battle fatigue and strain, and this was taken in place in 1918. Now, this is not, I wouldn't say this is unique to the Australians. However, in 1918, the Australian divisions and the Corps towards the end was continually in the front line from March through to October 1918. So this was right at the time of the German Spring Offensive, and then preparing for and going through the 100-day offensive. And there was an impression that was growing that Australian troops were often being asked to do more than their fair share of the difficult fighting, and often picking up unfinished work from others. And when I say others, that invariably meant a British unit or division that was on their flank. So there was this sentiment that was coming up. Now, this is quite a well-known photograph here taken of an Australian platoon in August 1918, and this is the whole platoon. And so some battalions were going into fights, as it say here, with 150 men. This is the equivalent of 3 fully manned platoons, but there should be 16 platoons within a battalion. So they were very, very heavily undermanned going through. And towards the end of August, Major General Hobbs, who was commander of the 5th Division, he wrote to the Corps commander at the time, Monash, saying that his division was approaching the limits of its endurance. And that was seen on the 14th of September, a couple of weeks later, that there was the first, I've actually got mutiny, it's been called a mutiny, but the men effectively were told that they were being relieved, but in the process of their being withdrawn from the line, they were halted and told that they had to go back and they had to follow the retreating army. And basically they refused. In the end, they did go through, but the point had actually been made that, hold on, we're getting towards the end of our limit. The strain on the 2nd and 3rd divisions was also becoming, very, very strong. And when the 2nd division attacked at Mont Saint-Quentin, where their memorial is, where you saw that photograph, that picture before, men were running up the hill screaming like banshees in order to try to make them sound big, more than there actually were. And during that time, that actual attack, there were 8 VCs awarded around Péronne, which was the most at any one particular engagement by the Australians in the war. We also saw, which was what was probably the most sort of significant act of desertion, which took place in September 1918 by a company of the 1st Battalion. They had just lost all their officers, and they started to walk to the rear, leaving the other company that they was going to attack to fight it on their own with, I think, only something like a handful of officers and 84 men. So these 119 men were all court-martialed, and I believe all but one of them were found guilty of that. So that was probably, the most significant episode, and also, shows the battle fatigue. But also what was happening was, with the reduction in size of the fighting strength, a number of the battalions were getting below critical point. So Monash decided that he was actually going to disband a number of the battalions here, and all but the 60th refused. The 60th agreed, mainly because of the weight of power that Brigadier Pompey Elliott had over his 15th Brigade there. But it wasn't a case that we were refusing to fighting. In fact, what the 25th said, they said, right, next time there is a stunt, give us the hardest job. Because what will happen is we'll go over, we'll do it. If we're successful, we can prove that we're still worthy as the 25th and should not be disbanded. Otherwise, the German machine gunner and the German artilleryman would do your disbanding for you. So that was the sort of sentiment that was still there, which is this esprit de corps that the men had. But if we look at trying to quantify and look at the effect of strain on the men through numbers, if you look at the right-hand columns, these are the number of court-martials in the AIF in 17 and 18, and this represents the number of men, or percentage, 6-7%. So not much difference here. But if you look at our cohort, which is the 5th, 22nd that have gone through altogether, what you can see here is that there was a marked jump between in 1918 of the men that are committing crimes and being court-martialed. So I think this is showing that the degree of strain that was going through after a couple of years fighting was now starting to show in the discipline. And this can also now be seen in the rates of desertions, the desertion convictions that were taking place. And the other metric, coming back to our good old STDs, the rates of STD rates per 100 men in all the British armies, you could see was higher in 1918 than 1917. This is in the UK, and typically there were more cases back in the UK than there were in France, but you can see the jump there. And this is the 5th, 22nd comparison, and these are the actual numbers of the 5th, 22nd. So again, you can see a trend here of increasing numbers of sexually transmitted disease as time went on, which is an indication of discipline starting to erode. So I think in summary here, discipline was thus an ever-present problem in the AIF. But as Bean says, a volunteer army will contain a vast array of characters, and I guess none more so than this gentleman here, that I think most of you will recognise as John Barney Hines. And he was known as the Souvenir King, and I think you can probably tell why. He is a kleptomaniac. But I mean, he was English born to German immigrants that got married in England, had 2 children, decided to leave. He went to New Zealand for about a decade, where he developed quite an extensive criminal record there, but then decided to go to Australia and sign up for the AIF after the British Army had rejected, after the Royal Navy had rejected him as well in his earlier life. The AIF welcomed him in with open arms. And so Hines, to his battalion commanders, and he was in the 45th Battalion, which I believe was the same battalion that Private Lynch was in, that was talked about in the Somme Mud book. He was seen as a tower of strength for the men within the front line. But behind the line, then, as one other officer said, he wasn't a pain in the neck, he was two pains in the neck. And through the war, he was responsible for no less than 9 court-martials. But he did a job in the army. So you could see that even with these court-martials and his discipline, the way that the Australians were set up, they were still releasing people to put them back into the fighting line, particularly later on as the numbers started to deplete. So, going back to 1915 and 1916, Bean observed that a small group of criminals had enlisted. He said often older and born overseas, but looking at the numbers in the 5th 22nd, I see no difference. The average age of someone court-martialed was exactly the same as the people that weren't court-martialed in the 5th 22nd, and the same whether they were born overseas or not. Maybe later on, people like Hines, or men like Hines, someone they had in mind. But he could see heavy drinking, there was absent without leave, fighting with locals. There was the infamous Wassa riots that took place in a red light area of Cairo, where in excess of 2,000 Anzac troops rioted in the red light district there. And this is just before they found out that they were going to Gallipoli within a couple of weeks, but it was kind of glossed over a lot of the time there. But because there were problems that were taking place in Egypt, it was decided when the men came back from Gallipoli that they would move their camp from just outside Cairo here and down by the pyramids to a place called Tel El Kabir, which strategically was a lot better, close to the Suez Canal running down through here, where they expected the Turks to be attacking at any time across from the east. But of course, it meant that they were further away from the red lights and the temptations of Cairo. Also, what happened in February, March 1916 was a big reorganization. You had more men coming in, the formation of the 4th and 5th Divisions, but they also started to create specialist units, such as the Pioneers, such as the Machine Gun Corps as well. And some of the commanding officers of the battalions who were already in Egypt, they used this as an opportunity to offload some of their men to some of these unsuspecting new units. And we might be able to see some of this later. Now, the whole indiscipline that was happening down in Egypt was ringing alarm bells to the British back home. And they were worried that their impact when they came up to the Western Front would have a negative impact on particularly the Canadians here. So Lieutenant General Birdwood, who, as I said, he led the men into Anzac, he wrote to all men reminding them of their responsibilities and do not lose the great reputation that has been hard won and paid with sweat and blood on the beaches and the cliff tops of Anzac. Don't lose this just because of discipline. So when they left Egypt to go to France, plans were put in place that as they arrived through Marseille, that all the disembarkation of the ships would happen at night onto the trains and then off, so that there would be less temptation to go into town. And by the time that the 2nd Division, first of all, then the 1st and then the 5th had gone through, the French authorities said that no troops had behaved better than the Australians had gone through. So they were, on their best behaviour as they went through that. And then in 1916 to 1919, so on the Western Front, as we've seen, the Australian cases which were brought before court-martial were proportionally much higher than the British. There were the two parts of it, what they called the larrikin behaviour, so the slovenly, dress, the non-saluting of officers. This was an irritant to the British officers. In fact, of course, the Australians were winding up a lot of the British because of this. But it was more to do with the increasing numbers of absent without leave and desertion that was taking place as well. So this was a worry, and behaviour, as you saw here, deteriorated in 1917, particularly in the command depots. We talked about the fact that the pressure was being put now back onto the Australian government to try to make examples of some of the bad cases of desertion and that, but the Australian government, they held firm in their belief on this. On the flip side of that is we talked about field punishment number 1. When the 12th Brigade decided to actually put field punishment number 1 into more use, they did see a decrease in the amount of crime. So that one did work. We've seen also 1918, the battle fatigue that was taking place. And then right at the end of the war, the men that were coming out from France and Belgium back to the UK, down to southern England, waiting to go home, it took a while to get them back. So the whole discipline started to break down in the camps in the UK as well. So what we're going to look at now is change tack, and we're going to start to look at the men that actually went absent without leave and some desertions within the 5th 22nd. So first of all, I wanted to try to start off to see if was there any difference between the character of a man that was court-martialed within a group and those that weren't court-martialed. So on the left-hand side here, we have the court-martialed men in the 5th 22nd, and this is the whole of their cohort, all 154 men. So if we look, I think if we concentrate on the percentages here, so you can see the casualties are pretty similar, 68%. So over 2/3 of men within the court-martial group would become a casualty. So either killed in action or wounded. And that compares with 1 in 4, slightly more in the whole group, in the whole of the 5th 22nd. But when you add in the fact that a number of the men would be wounded on more than one occasion, then this group had 22 woundings in total, which for the 22 men is exactly 1, an average of 1 per person. And then if you look over here, it is 1.03. So pretty much identical. The chances of becoming a casualty were if you were court-martialed or not. Then if you think about things like awards, were the people that were being court-martialed the ones that were cowards and they were running away and they didn't want to do anything? Well, you can see here that 14% were received a military award versus 13% overall. So again, no difference. And the promotions is just slightly different. If you just added another man here that would be promoted, then it would be exactly the same. And then also, if you look at the amount of time that the men were with the unit, it made no difference at all. So on average, a man of the 5th 22nd was with the unit. So that's either in France or Belgium, 45% of the time, and it's pretty much exactly the same as it was for those that were court-martialed. So I think you can see that we can't really distinguish between the character, or find some sort of character differentiation between court-martialed and non-court-martialed. But now what we're going to do is we're going to look at some of these cases in more details. And the first 3 I have put up here are the most serious ones. These are the ones where the desertions took place. And so because of this, what I have done is I've actually kept these men anonymous, because ours is not to retrospectively judge why these men did this. And I do not want to prejudge or say things that which may without being there. But I think this is an example here to show that what was going on with those people that were the most persistent offenders. And I think we're starting here. The first thing is you can see they were all young men, 22, 21, 18. And then if you look at Private A here, he only spent 8% of his time with the unit. And he was sick on a number of occasions, absent without leave, 3 times without being a court-martialed. He went AWOL in April 17, but the most serious one, this was all happening when he was back in England. So he eventually made it over to Belgium at that time toward I think it was round about sort of September or just before that, sort of in the August time of 1917. And here we have, on the 19th of September 1917, he deserted. He got a field general court martial, so he deserted to the rear. What it says in his records that at first he presented himself as being wounded, but in fact he wasn't. Now, the 19th of September, the men were on the front line on the West Toit Ridge, and the day before that, 9 colleagues of C Company were all sheltering in a captured German blockhouse, which took a direct hit from a high explosive shell, and all 9 were killed instantaneously in there, and they are all buried together, close together in Hoog Cemetery. So, you know, this was going on. Maybe that was the thing that flipped him. He was probably one of these people that thought, okay, I didn't really want to be in the army in the first place. Remember, he's a volunteer, you know, given the fact that he probably spent most of the time out in England. Anyway, he was the sentence towards the end of the year, he was let out of prison. But even after the fighting had stopped, he wanted to get away, and he went absent without leave in Belgium, and he was caught wearing the cap and a greatcoat of a Belgian soldier. So he's trying to escape. Now, privates B and C, what you don't see from this, that in fact these are sequential service numbers. So these 2 guys would have been mates right from the word go. And you can see that both of them were wounded in action in Poitiers in 1916. And they both had very similar sort of discipline records here, going absent without leave, drunk, overstaying leave in the UK. But it was not until June of 1918 when things were serious. And at this time, the 22nd were on the Morlancourt Ridge. They were supporting an attack that was taking place by another brigade on the right-hand side. The 22nd were doing a bit of a diversionary attack, and it was led by Lieutenant Harricks. And it was one of the most successful raids that took place during this time. They went over, and they didn't suffer a single casualty, and then they reported 30 of the enemy killed when they came back. So Harricks was awarded the Military Cross. There's about 4 other men that were awarded as well. But this was sort of environment that the men were living at the time, where, you know, these raids were taking place. And I think by this, you know, that they probably felt as though they had done their bit, having been wounded. So you can see here they had 5 years penal servitude for something quite serious, but both of them were suspended. Again, I guess it was believed because numbers were running down and they needed men back onto the front line. But only a month later, they were down towards Villers-Bretonneux. They were in the reserve line at that particular time, and both of them deserted. This time, Private B got 15 years penal servitude, whereas Private C got life, and it was commuted to 5 years. Now, I think I haven't mentioned this as well, but when we're talking about trying to make examples, there was Major Godley, who was commanding officer of the New Zealanders at Gallipoli. He went on to become the commanding officer of the 2nd Anzac Corps. So at that time he had the 3rd Division coming in alongside the New Zealanders. He could see what was happening within the Australian divisions, and he advocated, look, okay, I understand about not using the death penalty, but why not mean that if you've got a penal servitude, if you're going in prison, that it's there to stay, and you'll be serving it after the war as well. But that didn't happen. We're going to look at quickly at Harold Smith. He was another persistent offender, but I think he probably represents more of the typical Australian sort of play hard, work hard ethic there. Age 19, again, very young, and a hairdresser. So not exactly your Crocodile Dundee sort of stereotype of a bushman, hard Australian soldier. But anyway, he saw action throughout the war. He was wounded on 3 occasions, up in the nursery district, or the nursery area up near Armentières, back at Dornencourt during the German Spring Offensive, and then later at Morlancourt, which is that time I was talking about in the last one, when he got gassed. And his military discipline primarily was when he was back in England. And so he had district court martial on 2 occasions. And then when he was recovering from his gunshot wound to the forehead, and he was working his way back through the AIF depot in Le Havre, he got drunk. He was given a field general court martial and awarded 28 days field punishment number 1. And this is the only example of field punishment number 1 we have with the 5th 22nd. And the reason why I think that was the case is because it happened at depot. And so they were probably going to be a little bit more stricter on what they were going to be doing. And also the fact that there would be hardly any members of his unit there for him to be seen in front of. So, so anyway, this was the only field punishment number 1 that came up. And because he was a good fighting man, well thought of, he was promoted to Lance Corporal at the end of October 1917, which was the end of the Broodsinder Polkappel in 3rd Ypres. And we're going to quickly go through some of the others. We got at the top, we got Private Hoskin, who has the unfortunate distinction of not only being the first of the 5th 22nd to be court-martialed in Europe, but he was also killed in action. He was the first one to be killed in action of the 5th 22nd in the whole of the war. He was killed by the same shell as his mate 2339, Private Hogan. So that's a Private Hoskin, and he's buried in the at Russian Farm. Private Kerr, these are all in sequential order, by the way, decreasing. If you look here, May 1916, so they weren't in the front at this stage, disobeying command of a superior officer. He was given 5 years penal servitude for this, which I think seems to be quite harsh for this. He was let out, and he went back, and he was wounded in action in May 1918. Wakely and Hayes, you can see, missed embarkation. They were 2 of 5 men that missed the boat, the Austerley, when they left from Melbourne in 1915, put into Fremantle. 5 of them didn't come back on board, and they had to catch other transports later on. And we got Private Stevens here, but the people that are paying attention would notice that that's a Stevens with a V and not a PH. So that is not my grandfather there. Another anonymous one, Private D. The reason why I've made him anonymous here, even though he's just had 1 court-martial, is if you look here, he went absent without leave on 8 occasions. He also contracted an STD on 4 occasions. So if you look at his record, there was this cycle of going absent without leave, getting an STD, going into hospital, getting cured, and then maybe sometimes coming back to camp, or even jumping from hospital to do the same thing again. So, it seems as though this individual was using a certain methodology, which a lot of British High Command saw this akin to self-harming and should be treated a lot more seriously. He was using this way to keep out from the front. At the bottom, we got Private Smiley, and I think this is probably the most saddest case, or the most unfortunate one here. If you look here, Private Smiley, he was with the unit 78% of the time. So if you look at his record, what it does, it just says arrive, left Egypt, arrived Marseille, and then there was an entry saying went on leave, and then the next thing you have is the fact that he had been court-martialed. So there was nothing in there the rest of the time which shows that he was with the unit. So he went through the whole of Poitiers. He was there with the horrible mud at Flers. He was there at Beaucourt. He was there at 3rd Ypres as well. So he had gone through the whole thing. And then he just disobeyed an order. I don't know what that order was, and from that he was given 12 months imprisonment with hard labour. But you know, you could have think, well, if there's a person that's done his bit, then that's probably Smiley. But you know, I think the sad thing is that he gets this sentence in May 1918, but he is released, and he goes back to the front, back to the Moorland Court area again, where he is gassed, and sadly, 5 days later, he dies of his wounds. So this is Private Smiley, his resting place at the San Rica British Cemetery in France. And what we're going to do now, we're going to, yes, Private Carmody, again, one of the chaps that missed the embarkation twice. I don't know if this is an example of someone being transferred to another unit, having already displayed some indiscipline. Private Roberts here. So he has the holy Trinity, not the Holy Trinity, but the three main items of World War I, which is shell shock, gassed, and trench feet. So he actually got the full World War I experience. Did Private Roberts. He was had a court martial in November 1918 for going absent without leave. Private Samways, there's a picture of him. He was wounded in action in Poitiers, and he went absent without leave on a number of occasions. And you can see here, Field General Court Martial, November 1918. And I will be returning to Private Samways shortly. And then last but not least on this lot, we have Corporal Clack, who was 100% with the unit, but at age 44, he was attached to General Birdwood's HQ. And in February 1919, he was charged with drunkenness and charged the princely sum of £1. So now we're going to look at three of the other characters here. The first one is John or Jack McFarland. He's age 19 from Port Melbourne. He suffered from sickness early on, so he didn't actually make it to the 22nd Battalion until 1917. But when he arrived, he was a very, very popular person, member of the battalion, because he became captain of the 22nd Battalion football team. He was a boxing champion. He won swimming races, and he also won athletics races. So, you know, a real good, solid sportsman, like, you know, very much the caricature that we'd think of an Australian. And he was actually awarded the Distinguished Conduct Medal during the campaign in 3rd Ypres for his actions as a runner, both on the 4th of October at Broodsinder and on the 9th at Polkapel, where on one occasion he actually volunteered to go forward to try to find a section which had become lost and separated from the main group, and he managed to bring them back. So for this, he got his military medal, sorry, Distinguished Conduct Medal. And following on this, he was promoted to Lance Corporal, but on his own request in February, he wanted to go back, just become a regular private. But Jack, he ran full. He had indiscipline records as well. And as you can see here, they started when he was in Egypt, and then also when he went to England. And then when he was on leave, or when he was back in Le Havre, he was in a bar and he was getting a little drunk. The barman refused to sell him anymore. He said, no, give me some beer. There were other Australians in there, and an officer came up and said, come on, mate, you need to go now. McFarland didn't take too kindly from that, turned around and he hit him. So hitting an officer is not exactly a best move. And so he had the Field General Court Martial, to which he received 3 years penal servitude and also the forfeiture of his DCM. But because he was popular amongst the whole of the battalion, including the officers, they wrote a letter and saying that whether he can have his DCM reinstated, and it was. But anyway, when he was in prison, he attempted escape and he injured a knee and an ankle falling from the top of the fence. And also, right at the very end of the war, he was the last of the Australians in the 5th 22nd to return, because he did not embark for return to Australia, and he was declared an illegal absentee. Now, when Jack got back to Australia, he lived in Port Melbourne. He was an active member of the Port Melbourne Football Club, and he remained a member for the rest of his life. And to this very day, there is a medal called the club's best and fairest, and it's known as the Jack McFarland Medal in honour of John Jack McFarland. So here we go. So this is to my grandfather, George Stevens, age 17 when he enlisted, just weeks after hearing that his uncle William Pinkerton had been killed at Anzac. He did service in on the Western Front. He was wounded in action at Fleur, and then at Le Sars, where he was only back with the unit for 2 days before he had another blighty. So here's George here. But when he got back to England, this is where his indiscipline started, particularly when he teamed up with his old mate Charles Samways that I spoke about beforehand. So in August 1917, both Private Samways and Private Stevens went absent without leave for 6 weeks, and they were declared illegal absentees. Now, we pieced this together since, because my grandfather never spoke about this, but what we found out that his grandfather owned a hotel in Ealing called the Feathers Hotel. And it just so happened that Charles Samways here, he was English born and he was born in Ealing. So he would have said to George, come on, let's go and see if we can track down your family and see if we can find his hotel stroke pub. Now, his grandfather had long since died, but he had 2 sons, Edwin and Fred, that were both hoteliers too. And they were owning this hotel here called the Drayton Court in Ealing. And in 1914, in their staff, working down in the kitchens, they had a certain Vietnamese pastry chef and dishwasher. And I always ask people, if we're in, face to face, name me one famous Vietnamese people, and people look at me at blank. Of course, there is only one, and it's Ho Chi Minh. So Ho Chi Minh was there. So I think I can say that my family has had a part in developing one of the world's leading revolutionaries in history here. But it was not just the hotel. Edwin also set up the Lyric Theatre, which was in Ealing. So, and there was a gentleman's club for like smoking rooms, snooker, reading rooms as well. So there was a lot of sort of entertainment that was taking place, but not just in Ealing. And so if you see this photograph here, you should also be able to read what it says on the top. This is the world famous Eel Pie Island Hotel in Twickenham, which of course, I think probably there's a few people on this call today that may well have been there in its heyday in the 60s when the Stones and the Who were all playing there. But Edwin owned this hotel during the First World War, and at that time, it was a centre for tea dances. So my grandmother was living just down the road, and I think this is where the two of them met. So he had reasons to go there. So anyway, they were declared that they were actually arrested back in after 6 weeks. But instead of having the book thrown at them for being away from 6 weeks, the First Division had already changed their guidelines from 1 week to 3 weeks for court-martials. This was 6 weeks. They had nothing. They had nothing. All they did was going straight back to the Overseas Training Brigade, where they toughened up back to the front, and they went back where my grandfather George was wounded at Dernancourt. He was gassed as well at Moulincourt, And then eventually on the last action of the 22nd Battalion in the war, he was awarded the military medal for volunteering as a stretcher bearer going forward to bring back the wounded. But his indiscretions didn't end there, and he went to Field General head of. He went absent without leave again with Charles Sandways on the 11th of November, which I think you could imagine there was one or two parties that were taking place there. And I think the reason why is that he had this in mind. He had met the lady of his dreams, Minnie Taylor, and this is where they got married here at St. Stephen's Church in East Twickenham. Now, I don't have a picture of their wedding day, but I do have a picture of my Auntie Betty's wedding day. And this is my grandparents here with yours truly sitting in the middle.
Yeah.
So the last one I want to have a look at out of our 5th 22nd is Private Oswald Hunt, another 21-year-old here, wounded in action at Broodsinder. The military discipline, not too much here, but he went AWOL in England, and he actually thought, you know, maybe I've had enough here. I've just been wounded up in the Passchendaele battles here. So he went walkabout, and he was away for. He was arrested some months later in Manchester. He was given a district court martial with 4 months detention. But he was let back right towards the end of the war. And with this map here, you can see that this is where we're moving up towards Beaurevoir and also Montbrahim. Now, the 22nd Battalion had been withdrawn on the night of the 5th and 6th of October. But they were replaced by a fresh American regiment called the 117th, and volunteers were asked for in order to guide the Americans onto to the Jot. And Ozzy Hunt, he put his hand up and did that. But it wasn't just a case of him taking them to, showing them where the line was. The Americans came under heavy fire. The commanding officer became a casualty. So Hunt took them forward to the Jot. Then the attack started, and as the attack started, he was on the Jot watching this happen. He could see that a section of men were held up by a particular strong point that the Germans had. So he asked permission from the Americans, and he ran forward, took control of this unit, and then managed to clear that position. And then off they went. So I think this does two things here. One, it shows what Beaton talked about earlier about the Australian, particularly the private, being a leader of men. Men of all nationalities will look up to him, and and this was certainly the case. And then the other thing is, if you see here, we've got District Court Martial and Distinguished Conduct Medal here. Both of them are frequently abbreviated by DCM. So as we are finishing here on the case studies within the 5th 22nd, I think you can easily see here that you can use DCM in equal abundance for an Australian soldier. It could be to do with discipline, or it could do with bravery. And with Oswald Hunt, it's for the same man here. So we're moving towards the conclusion here, and the approach to discipline amongst the World War combatants changed. Now, we talked a lot earlier on about the use of the death penalty and how important that was, or there seemed to be a correlation between indiscipline in the Australians versus the rest of the British Army. But if you look against the German army, they used the death penalty less as well. They only had 48 executions out of 150 sentences. And Ludendorff, towards the end, he suggested that the absence of a much stricter British-style punishment there would have been better, and for Germany's outcome in the war. Now, when it comes to the French, they actually executed 600 of the 2,000 sentences. But as we know, their greater use of the death penalty did not stop the French army mutinies, nor did the fact of the reintroduction of the Roman practice of decimation in 1916, because there was a mutiny that took place in the Italian army. That didn't stop the ill discipline within the Italian army. And it was more down to the impact of leadership, training, morale. These were far more important. And then the Russian army, discipline was poor there. They reintroduced flogging at one stage in 1915. But as we also know, in 1917, the whole of military discipline broke down as part of the full-scale revolution. So you can't just say that it's all down to the use of things like the death penalty. And I think overall, if you think about what military discipline is, and it's ultimately designed to prepare men for the traumas of battle, that the British Army over of the centuries that we have, helped to, or had half the world painted pink, that the British Army and the discipline in the army was effective in controlling the army to do the will of the politicians of that particular time. So we're now coming towards the conclusion about looking at the discipline and the effectiveness of the AIF. And I would say it's a game of two halves, really. I hope that's not a wrong analogy to use, but despite early failures at the beginning of the war with Gallipoli, the disaster at Fromelles, which was still ranks as the worst day in Australian military history, Poitiers, Bullecourt, and then there was a distrust of the British High Command. That the AIF developed into one of the most revered fighting forces of World War I. And I think things started to change at Messines when it was a much better, well-executed, well-planned operation under Plumer's command there. So things started to change there with Messines, and that was actually used Monash's 3rd Division there. But the effectiveness really started to grow when they worked together side by side. And that first happened at Broodsinder here, where the 1st Anzac Corps, so we had the 1st and the 2nd Division next to the 3rd, and the New Zealanders all attacked in the area around Zonnebeke up to Tyne-Cot. The 3rd Division took where Tyne-Cot is now. And for those of you that know the Passchendaele Museum at Zonnebeke, the lake behind you is the exact point that the 22nd attacked on that day, on the 4th of October. And Plumer hailed it as the greatest victory since the Marne. And it also represented the high point of the 3rd Ypres campaign. And then where they really made their name was in 1918 with the defense, as the Germans were pouring westwards, the defense around Albert, Dernancourt, Morlancourt, down towards Villers-Bretonneux. Then the use of peaceful penetration, which kept the pressure on the Germans with these miniature raids. But the Australians also realised that by doing small bite-size attacks, it was better for them in their survival than a full-scale major attack. So they actually realized it was better, even though it was going to be very, very scary for the people that took part in it, that to actually keep the pressure on the Germans through something called peaceful penetration. And there was the well-documented attack at Hamel, which was used by Monash as the blueprint for the 8th of August attack. And then, of course, the Black Day itself, the German army, the 8th of August, where the 4 Australian divisions, they leapfrogged each other with the Canadians on the right-hand side. So the effectiveness of the Australians really came to the fore from March 1918 onwards, at the very, very point that everything I've shown you before shows you that the discipline was going down. So, it doesn't hold that the poor discipline at all impacted the effectiveness of the AIF fighting. And if you look about, what people are saying, Haig conceded that Australian battle discipline had held up during the war, despite the poor discipline away from the front. He probably said that through gritted teeth underneath his moustache. And then also the Australian Parliament, it stuck to the belief in its men and its senior officers all the way, even then when there was pressure coming through, and they believed in the leadership, the training, the camaraderie on the morale. But I don't think it really matters what either Hague was saying or the Parliament was saying. I think what really, really counts is what the people in France, the people that the Australians came to help liberate, were thinking. And I think many of you will recognise this plaque here, which is outside the school in Villers-Bretonneux, which was the gift of school children of Victoria here, and where there is the sign, "N'oublions jamais l'Australie." Let us never forget Australia. And to this very day, Australia is held in such high regard and affection by the people of this particular area. And so the final two slides here we've got are the quotes here from first of all from the Premier of France after he'd visited Monash after the Hamel victory in July. And just summarize here, it says, "I shall go back tomorrow and say to my countrymen, I have seen the Australians, I've looked in their faces, I know that these men will fight alongside of us again until the cause for which we are all fighting is safe for us and our children." And then the final words go to the big man himself, Lieutenant General John Monash, who was the corps commander from the end of May to the end of war. And he talks about, he says, "Very much and very stupid comment has been made upon the discipline of the Australian soldier. That was because the very conception and purpose of discipline have been misunderstood. It is, after all, only a means to an end, and that end is the power to secure coordinated action among a large number of individuals for the achievement of a definitive purpose. It does not mean lip service, nor obsequious homage to superiors, nor servile observance of forms and customs, nor suppression of individuality. The Australian Army is a proof that individualism is the best and not the worst foundation upon which to build up collective discipline." And with that, I thank you very much. And this final slide here is actually from the website that I developed, which told the story, or tells the story, of the 22nd Battalion in real time through the war between 1914 to 1919. So thank you very much.
I turned up and it means the world to me. It's the symbol of our nation, the land of